Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, a series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Franklin Roosevelt, and the focus is Triumphant Return. The year is 1928. Roosevelt coming to grips with his polio and the long-term prognosis now for the paralysis below his waist, but he's still thinking he wants to get back into politics, and he and Louis Howe are strategizing. Is this the right year? It's an election year. Should we jump back in? And he's basically thinking this is not the right time. The country, the economy is booming. The Republicans had been in power, and Roosevelt made the point that, look, in 1920, after the poke we got that year, I remarked I didn't think the nation would elect a Democrat again until the Republicans had led us into a serious period of depression and unemployment. I still believe that forecast holds true. People will not turn out the Republicans while wages are good and the markets are booming. At the national level, you'd be very much correct about that. Al Smith, the governor of New York, is going to run for president again in 1928. Roosevelt had made his return to national politics when he nominated Smith at the 1924 Democratic Convention. Smith wanted him to do it again in 1928. In Houston, he did. Again, very successful. Great reception for Roosevelt at the convention. But he wasn't really interested in playing a role in the general election campaign, even though Smith got the nomination. After the convention, Roosevelt was off to Warm Springs, Georgia, continuing his recuperation. Against Smith for the presidency, the Republicans countered with Herbert Hoover. He'd been the Commerce Secretary for the last 8 years, so part of this prosperous period in American history for the economy and the American people. He had also been a hero in World War I, where he helped save Belgium from starving and served as the U.S. Food Administrator during the war, so well-known, popular candidate. Is going to be very tough to beat. And Al Smith and the Democratic leaders knew this. They knew one thing they had to have: New York. New York, the most electoral votes in the Electoral College. If they didn't win New York, they were not going to have a chance at the presidency. And for that, they needed to turn out the Democratic vote. For that, they wanted a top candidate to run for governor. Who did they want? Franklin Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt heard these entreaties and he said, well, no, not right time for me. I'm still recuperating. I'm only 46 years old. I've got plenty of time to run for governor in the future. Now's not the right time. Now, mostly this was politics. He just didn't think this was a year in which Democrats were going to win either nationally or at the state level. Well, Al Smith and his team, they were unrelenting, putting the pressure on Roosevelt. And it came down to the night before the Democrats were going to have their nomination for the Democratic nomination for governor in New York. So the day is at hand, and they're trying to get Roosevelt on the phone to put in one more piece of pressure, and Roosevelt is basically hiding out. He's at a picnic, he's speaking at a barbecue, really anything to stay away from the telephone, the telegraph. Well, Al Smith had an ace up his sleeve: Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt kind of began living separate lives. She's pursuing her own interests and aligned herself with the Al Smith campaign, helping to bring some of the social issues that she cared about into the campaign, also helping to get the women's vote out. Well, Al Smith turned to Eleanor and said, look, can you get your husband on the phone? I've got to talk to him. She was a little reluctant. She finally agreed, got him on the phone. It was after midnight. She handed the phone immediately to Smith, got out of that room, took a train back to New York City, didn't want to be around for the rest of the conversation. Well, that conversation was pretty intense. Smith was putting the pressure. Roosevelt is saying no. Missy, LeHand, is in the room basically telling Roosevelt, don't you dare say yes to this, because she knew it wasn't what he wanted, didn't think it was the right time. But the bottom line for Al Smith was, look, Frank, I told you I wasn't going to put this on a personal basis, but I've got to. I just want to ask you one more question. If those fellows nominate you tomorrow and adjourn, will you refuse to run? And at that point, Roosevelt had kind of a fateful pause, long enough for Smith to jump back in. All right, I won't ask you any more questions. He hung up the phone, and very next day, Roosevelt was nominated by acclamation by the Democrats. He was going to run for governor, whether he liked it or not, thanks to that fateful pause and Al Smith being so unrelenting. Well, once he's in, he's going to try to obviously win this election. And he had Louis Howe running the campaign. He's got Ed Flynn, the former boss of the Bronx, also in the inner circle, along with Jim Farley. Sam Rosenman was writing a lot of the speeches. Missy, of course, the personal secretary, and a new member of her team, Grace Tully, came into the inner circle to help out as well. In New York, the general election campaign, basically a 4-week sprint. And Roosevelt still had a lot going for him, right? He had name recognition. He was likable. He was a progressive in a progressive-leaning state. Big questions, though, continue about his health. Could someone with polio, could someone who has leg paralysis in his legs actually do the job as be governor of New York? Well, this was an education opportunity for not only the people in New York, but frankly the country, because polio really had no effect on what really mattered if you were going to do a job like governor. And one of the people making this point was Al Smith on Roosevelt's behalf. The real fact is this: Frank Roosevelt today is mentally as good as he ever was in life. Physically, he's as good as he ever was in life. His whole trouble is his lack of muscular control of his lower limbs. But the answer to that is that a governor doesn't have to be an acrobat. We don't elect him for his ability to do a double backflip or a handspring. The work of the government is brain work. 95% of it is accomplished sitting at a desk. There is no doubt about his ability to do it. Roosevelt was ready to prove this as well. A very active campaigner, gave dozens of speeches every day, all manner of weather, tons of energy, stamina. He showed he was ready to return and take on this job. Well, in the national level, the election results, Herbert Hoover trounced Al Smith. Hoover won 40 of the 48 states, including New York, and Roosevelt went to bed that night thinking he had lost the race for governor as well. A couple of people stayed up, though, to watch the final polls come in, including Howe and Sara Roosevelt. Interesting pair, because they didn't really care for each other, but they're there in Hyde Park waiting to see the results. And all of a sudden, things began to change. Around 2 a.m., things were getting pretty close. 4 a.m., Roosevelt actually took the lead. And when the final votes were counted the next day, Roosevelt won the governorship by less than 0.5%. Indeed, triumphant return to politics for Franklin Roosevelt. Takes the oath of office January 1st of 1929, 30 years to the day after Theodore Roosevelt had taken the same oath, and there were immediately tensions for Franklin Roosevelt to deal with, mainly dealing with Al Smith. So Smith had lost the presidency, so he figured, well, maybe I'll just kind of keep running the state of New York like he had for so many years as governor before, and he was really encouraging Roosevelt to keep his top aides in office, including two in particular: the Secretary of State, Robert Moses, and his top administrative aide, Belle Moskovitz. Well, Roosevelt wasn't so sure about this. It wasn't really good for him to be too aligned, seeing almost like a subordinate to Smith. This was his administration now. He had outpolled Smith in the state of New York in the recent election, needed his independence. So he did keep many of Smith's staffers on board, but not Moses, not Moskovitz. Tension between him and Smith, frankly, it was the beginning of the end of that relationship, which would go very much in different directions over the next couple of years. Now, for Roosevelt, as governor, living in the governor's mansion, he would start most days in his bedroom, in his pajamas, reading the newspaper and meeting with his staff in the bedroom to plan the activities for the day. The governor's mansion was always very lively during Roosevelt's tenure, full of boisterous meals, a lot of political talk, but also games and movie nights and things like that. Not a lot of family around for Roosevelt at this time. Eleanor Roosevelt spent about half her time in Albany, living in a separate room in the governor's mansion, but also spent about half her time in New York City. She was teaching American history, 19th century literature at the Todhunter School. She wasn't about to give that up. She spent the first 3 days of the week there and then come to Albany for the second half of the week. The kids, they were all out of the house. Anna's now married. James is at Harvard. The other three boys are all at Groton. So not a lot of family around, but his new family, his political and business family, Howe, Missy, LeHand, they were there. They both had rooms and they were staying in the governor's mansion as well. Note about Eleanor Roosevelt, she had a new companion during this period, the name of Earl Miller. Miller was actually the New York State police sergeant who was assigned as her bodyguard, her driver, became her very close companion, spent a lot more time with Eleanor than Franklin Roosevelt did. And there were, of course, rumors and speculation that the relationship was more than this, maybe a personal, intimate relationship. The son James actually thought so, but again, no concrete evidence to support that. We just don't know what the closeness or how close that relationship was between Eleanor Roosevelt and Earl Miller. Policies for the governor. He was a progressive, focusing on tax relief for farmers, new roads for farm-to-market businesses, conservation, reforestation, rural electrification was important to Roosevelt, rights to labor, and hydroelectric power. Wanted to get more power coming out of the St. Lawrence River. Now, it was a Republican-led legislature, but Roosevelt got a lot of his agenda through, but not that last one. The hydroelectric power on the St. Lawrence, that did not come during his time. It's an interesting point, though, because from his days in Georgia at Warm Springs, as he got to know the farmers there, most of them had no electricity. And this was a difference of opinion between sort of the progressive Democrats and the conservative Republicans on the role of government. Even the conservative Republicans like Herbert Hoover believed that for the capital investments needed for things like hydroelectric power, building dams, that was a function that the government could and should do. But they drew a very hard line at the distribution of power. They believed that would be Marxist if the government took over that role. That is a role for the private sector to take on. Roosevelt wasn't so sure because he had been there in Georgia and he saw all these farmers, and frankly, the private sector was not serving them. It was uneconomic for them to actually build out the distribution network to bring power to these farms, and he thought maybe we need to change this. Maybe the government should step in and play some of that role. He would not be successful in this regard in New York. He would take these ideas nationally, though, when he became president. 10 months into his tenure as governor of New York, everything changed when the stock market crashed. October, November of 1929, the New York Stock Exchange losing about 40% of its value almost overnight. Now, initially, everyone's basically saying, don't panic. President Hoover, the fundamental business of the country, that is, the production and distribution of goods and services, is on a sound and prosperous basis. Even Roosevelt made the point that industrial and trade conditions are sound. The industrialist John Rockefeller is actually interested in buying good stocks at this point in time. But over time, week after week, month after the month, the rest of the economy really began to suffer. Unemployment really rising. President Hoover's encouraging businesses to retain their people, to keep prices and wages up, to accelerate public works, to put people to work, but no direct aid for unemployed. That was the policy of Herbert Hoover. Again, never done that before in American history. When these kind of panics had ensued, the government really didn't play a role in providing relief to the individual public, but Roosevelt thinking, well, maybe it is time to make a change. These people are suffering. Maybe we need to do something differently. But before he could act on any of that, he had to get reelected in the state of New York. He had only a 2-year term, so in 1930, he's going to run again. He talked about the difference between himself as a progressive Democrat and the conservative Republicans. Progressives in the right sense of the word mean those who realize that a government must grow and change as its people grow and change. That what is wise government today may be foolish government tomorrow. The conservatives are those who believe things are good enough as they are and should be let strictly alone, lest ruin and destruction follow in the wake of any alteration. In his mind, that approach, President Hoover's approach, simply wasn't working during this terrible depression. He was one of the leaders at the state level in thinking about providing relief for his citizens. He established the Temporary Emergency Relief Agency, TERA, the first relief agency like this of its kind in the entire country. As for his health, again, the issue came up again when he was running for a re-election. There had been no issues with his health during his first two years in office. And then he got a little bit of a boost when the Equitable Life Assurance Company granted him a $560,000 life insurance policy. Again, as far as they were concerned, there was no health issue to worry about. And basically, the people agreed. It was overwhelming vote of confidence for Franklin Roosevelt. He beat the U.S. Attorney Charles Tuttle by 725,001 vote. In this time, Roosevelt liked to make the statement, I cast that one vote. Well, 2 more years in the governorship for Franklin Roosevelt. He signed up for that, but he's already setting his sights on another job in the next election cycle 2 years forward, but that is the story for another day. That is Franklin Roosevelt and Triumphant Return from the life of Franklin Roosevelt. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.